Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases, as well as a little bit of fashion and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. So for today's video, I'm back with another unsolved disappearance case, and for today's video we're going to be discussing the case of DIANE AUGAT. So if you want to hear a little bit about the case and its details, then keep on watching and we shall just get started. DIANE Louise AUGAT was born on February the 21st in the year of 1958. At the time of her disappearance, she was 40 years old and living in a place called Odessa in Florida. For a number of years, she'd been married to a man named Frederick, and the pair had had 3 children together, a son and 2 daughters. She was known in those years to have a real love for art and outdoor activities like fishing and camping in particular. And when DIANE was 30 years old, she was told that she had bipolar disorder. The main characteristics of bipolar disorder involve the individual constantly finding themselves in episodes where they will experience either extreme depression or the polar opposite, so extreme states of happiness where they're on such a high that they almost appear manic. In the year of 1988, one of these episodes of DIANE's led to a particularly bad outcome, which then resulted in her losing custody of all of her children. And then in 1991, her and her husband officially divorced. This drastic life change had proven to be particularly hard for DIANE, and it's believed that it resulted in her turning to alcohol and recreational drug use as a form of coping. Her mother had also believed that around this time she'd spent the majority of her time being on and off her medication for her bipolar disorder, so she was never really consistently taking it, according to her mother, and this meant that many of her episodes that she would experience would remain quite drastic because there was nothing maintaining them. DIANE's alcohol use had escalated by April of 1998, by which point she was considered to have a severe alcohol problem, and she'd even been committed involuntarily a vast number of times over the recent years because of the outbursts that she'd had. Following her last stay in a mental health ward, she ended up moving in with her sister, a woman named Deborah Cronin. On April the 10th, 1998, at 11 AM, DIANE was known to have left the house on Chesapeake Bay Drive as normal. She'd said goodbye to her sister and headed out to what her sister had believed was a doctor's appointment. The next sighting of her had been at the Hayloft pub just 3 miles from her home later on in the day. According to the bartender that had been working there, he'd had to cut her off and refuse her any more alcohol simply because she'd been highly intoxicated and was, as he'd put it, walking in circles. And then the next sighting of her had come from a motorist who'd seen her walking north on the US 19 route near North York Avenue. But this sighting in particular had been on the following day, meaning that DIANE had not returned to her home the previous evening. After this point, a believed sighting of her had come sometime between April the 11th and April the 14th. At some point in this time period, she had been spotted at the Coral Sands Motel on US 19, but aside from these vague details, not a lot of information is known regarding this particular sighting. And then on April the 14th, a woman working in the inn attached to the Gulf Hotel had recalled seeing DIANE eating lunch at her workplace. And that very same night, DIANE's mother had returned to her home in the evening and noticed that a message had been left for her on the answering machine. Upon listening, she recognised the caller immediately to be her daughter, who she hadn't heard from in days. She said that in the message, DIANE had sounded particularly distressed, shouting, "Help, help, let me out." According to her mother, it then sounded like someone had gone and grabbed the phone away from her as she heard a distinctive scuffling noise. And then DIANE's voice once again said, "Hey, give me that," before the call ended. This phone call could never be traced despite law enforcement's active attempts, but the one piece of information they could gather from this phone call had been the name from the caller ID. It had said that the call had been placed from something called Starlight, which, when they investigated it, they discovered that there were 6 known businesses in the Odessa area using that name. None of them were located in Odessa specifically, but they were all within a short distance from one another. But aside from this, very little else could be determined in relation to the case at this point. The next break in the case came about on the 15th of April. At around 4 PM, a local woman was on her way to work along the US 19 route, not far from the same location in which the previous sightings of DIANE had taken place. It was here that she discovered what would later turn out to be a severed human fingertip. Initially, she thought possibly she'd been mistaken or it was like a fake, considering it would be kind of a rather unusual thing for her just to come across on her way to work. But later on that night, she decided to mention her finding to her boyfriend, who decided to take it upon himself the next day to go and check out the weird sighting. As it turns out, her initial concerns had been correct and it was in fact a severed human fingertip. Reported the sighting to local law enforcement. They checked it out for themselves, and their later tests would determine that it was in fact a DNA match to the missing DIANE AUGAT. It was later discovered that at some point between the day of her disappearance and April the 18th, DIANE's house had actually been broken into. Because of the fact that DIANE is unaccounted for, there was no way of knowing exactly when the break-in occurred, nor what exactly they could have taken from the house, because they didn't have like a complete list of what should have been there. At the time, it was actually suggested that it may have been connected to the timing of her disappearance, with some people also suggesting that perhaps she knew the people that were responsible for the break-in, or even giving them permission to use her home if she were to disappear for some reason. The next strange occurrence also occurred on April the 18th, when the manager of the convenience store that DIANE's sister worked at had discovered a bag of neatly folded clothes inside the freezer outside the back of the store. She thought it to be a very strange finding initially, and she decided to show Deborah what she'd come across. This is when Deborah had positively identified the clothes as being ones that she'd recently given to her sister DIANE. Aside from all of these little strange findings, little else came about in the case until almost 3 years later, on the 24th of November of the year 2000. An article had just been released in the Tampa Bay Times newspaper on DIANE's disappearance, and the very next day, DIANE's brother's girlfriend had made an unusual discovery. She'd walked into the Circle K convenience store located on US 19 when she'd come across a plastic Ziploc bag sat on the lottery counter that had the name DIANE written across it in black ink. The contents of the bag included some lipstick, a bottle of perfume with the branding Taboo, and some toothpaste, and ultimately the bag was positively identified as having belonged to DIANE. The location of this store in particular had been in an area that DIANE was known to spend a lot of time in before her disappearance. In particular, there was an incident in which she had to be picked up by police officers in the area for appearing manic just a few months before she disappeared. And then in June of the following year, DIANE's sister received a phone call that informed her that the police had just arrested a suspect in DIANE's case on a different murder charge. On June the 27th, 2001, 2 gunmen wearing masks had broken into the Coral Sands Hotel at 4 a.m. The couple who ran the hotel were attacked, however they managed to scare off the gunman when one of them managed to get his hands on his gun. This man's name was Gary Robert Abbas, and at the time he'd had his own suspicions as to who was responsible for the break-in at his hotel. And so, the very next day, he invited a 26-year-old local man named Todd Cammers over to the home office he owned behind the hotel. His main reason behind the suspicion had been because Cammers had had a history of being involved in local burglaries, and he believed it was a likely scenario that the pair of gunmen had to wear these masks because they knew that if they hadn't have done so, they would have been recognised. Cammers continued to deny his involvement in the break-in, but Evers wasn't convinced. He proceeded to pull out his gun and he shot Cammers multiple times in the face and torso. But the attack had actually been witnessed by a bystander, and they had immediately ran to the police to report it. As it would turn out, Cammers had been completely honest, and he was in fact not involved in the crime at all. And just a few months later, the 2 men who were actually responsible were identified as having carried out the burglary. The suspect in DIANE's case that the police had informed Deborah of had actually been Evers, the owner of the hotel who had shot Todd Cammers. The reasons for him having been a long-considered suspect in DIANE's case aren't exactly known, but it is known that one of the last sightings of DIANE had been either in or around the area of the Coral Sands Hotel. A witness had even come forward and reported an incident in which Evers had held him at gunpoint and demanded that he tell him where a specific woman was. According to law enforcement, all of these pieces of information combined led to a strong belief in him likely having been involved in DIANE's disappearance. Despite Deborah being informed of this link in the case, Evers was never officially charged as having an involvement in DIANE's disappearance. He was, however, found guilty of this other first-degree murder charge, and in 2004 was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And 8 years later, Evers died in prison while serving his sentence. And sadly, there have been no further developments in DIANE's case And sadly there have been no further developments in Diane's case, and Diane AUGAT remains missing to this very day. So that's everything I'm going to discuss today. Let me know your guys' thoughts, whether you think Evers maybe was a particularly likely suspect, or whether you think there's something else strange going on. A lot of theories have circulated regarding Diane's mental capacity, whether or not something may have happened. She may have had an episode and something could have happened, or whether she'd gotten herself into some trouble. There are just so many potential scenarios because not a lot of information is known, so nothing can really be pointed in any direction. So let me know your guys' thoughts, maybe your gut feelings on this case, and if you have any other case suggestions, please feel free to leave them down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.